Iraqi army foils an attack by ISIL militants on the holy shrine of Imam al-Hassan al-Askari in the northern city of Samarra. Obama gives Putin 1 month to change course over the Ukraine crisis before ratcheting up sanctions. The US and the EU condemn Israeli plans to construct over 1,000 additional settler units on occupied Palestinian land. And Bashar al-Assad says that the high voter turnout in Syria's presidential elections sends a strong message to the country's enemies. Good evening. You are watching Al-Attijah World News with me, Mariam Khaddad. The Iraqi army has thwarted a major attack on the city of Samarra by ISIL militants who were aiming to rekindle the sectarian violence of 2006 to 2007 by attacking the Shiite shrine of 2 holy imams in the city.
The horror of sectarian strife of 2006 is back to haunt the Iraqi people. Militants belonging to the Al-Qaeda offshoot, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, launched an unprecedented attack on the city of Samarra, north of the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. At dawn, ISIL fighters infiltrated the city in large numbers. The aim was to seize control of the revered Shiite Imam's shrine, located in the center of Samarra. Another reason is the city's strategic position just north of Baghdad. Had the militants been able to take control of Samarra, they would control the dam on the Tigris River and the only road leading to the north of the country. The militants, traveling in dozens of vehicles, some mounted with anti-aircraft guns, attacked a major checkpoint on the southeast side of Samarra with the help of sleeper cells from inside the city, killing at least 6 members of the country's security forces and burning their vehicles in the initial attack. However, the Iraqi army was able to foil the attack on the shrine, but fierce clashes continued for hours in various neighborhoods which were still occupied by the extremists. The surprise operation came on the backdrop of an Iraqi army push to retake the city of Fallujah, with the army severely restricting the movement of militants from the city. The Defense Ministry announced that a joint operations command in Samarra managed to destroy most of the terrorists and their vehicles. Iraqi army helicopters bombed militant positions before the army was able to fully clear the city.
Let's cross over to our Baghdad correspondent, Wissam al-Bayati, now for more. Wissam, has Samarra been cleared of militants completely now?
Yes, 2 hours ago, the Iraqi Defense Ministry has announced the end of the military operations over there, in addition to wiping out all the militants from the city. But at the same time, 30 minutes ago, some other agencies have announced that the militants have successfully took control again on some neighborhoods in the city of Samarra, but nothing has been actually confirmed by the Iraqi government, in addition to the announcement which was actually declared by the Iraqi government, especially the Defense Ministry, saying that the Iraqi security forces have successfully took over and regained the city of Samarra after more than 5 hours of clashes between the Iraqi army and the militants, and these militants actually, as you know, are linked to the ISIL terrorist group. In fact, according to the reports which actually we hear from the city of Samarra, they say that the militants have extremely damaged the city. In addition to, they used the people over there, I mean the local citizens and the residents of the city as a human shield. But the Iraqi Air Force played a very important role as they have actually struck the vital targets, and they have struck the leadership bases that was actually leading the military operations for the ISIL against the Iraqi army. So at the end of the day, the Iraqi government, represented by the Defense Ministry, have announced that the military operations have been finalized and the security have been restored, and the law and order have been imposed again in the city of Samarra. But Meanwhile, the announcement came out. The Iraqi Defense Ministry have ordered some certain units nearby the city of Samarra to move to the city of Samarra to fortify the city and increase the presence of the Iraqi army inside the city to prevent any counterattack or any attempt to retake the city by the militants. The attack was concentrated on two places. The first one nearby the holy two shrines, Al-Imamain Askariyin, and the second one nearby the dam, which actually located on the Tigris River, which is considered one of the main dams in Iraq. Therefore, the militants were trying to play on two ropes. The first one is to target the holy two imams, Al-Imamain Al-Askariyin, and blow it up exactly as they did in 2006, and reignite the sectarian violence and embarrass the government after taking control of the dam and lock it to sink the nearby cities and provinces. Yes.
Well, based on your information, how were these armed militants able to enter the city in the first place?
In the very beginning, I would like to tell you that the militants are really spread out, especially after the military operations in the city of Fallujah and after the surrounding the city and its outskirts by the Iraqi military, especially after the noticeable increase in the presence of the Iraqi army in all of its departments in the outskirts of the city of Fallujah. But the Iraqi army, especially after forming the military operations for the middle and the Tigris Military Operations Center and the Euphrates Military Operations Center, they have actually divided the Iraqi army into three parts. The first one taking control on the north region and the middle region and the south region. But what exactly has happened, the provinces, the so-called disputed areas, which consider the Mosul, Diyala, Tikrit, and even Kirkuk, these places are witnessing a low level of presence of the Iraqi security forces, as these places have been controlled by mostly Kurds. So that's why the militants have actually freely moved, because according to the description of most of the political experts and the security experts, they say that the Iraqi army presence inside these cities is required and heavily required, as the militants should be faced by some checkpoints and some governmental presence over there. So at the end of the day, the militants have successfully, as I mentioned, penetrated all the checkpoints that belongs to the Kurds and the joint forces reaching to the city of Samarra. So that's why the government should review its plans, as most of the political experts and most of the security experts are actually sharing the same idea, which is that the Iraqi government should review its security plans, especially in these areas, and increase its presence over there and fortify these provinces, especially the so-called disputed areas. Yes.
All right, Wissam al-Bayati, our Baghdad correspondent. It's good to see you. Thanks for those updates.
Thank you.
Well, G7 leaders all echoed criticism over Moscow's position on Ukraine, with U.S. President Barack Obama giving his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin, 1 month to back down or face more sanctions. At the summit in Brussels, leaders of the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany all called on Putin to recognize Ukraine's president-elect, Petro Poroshenko, withdraw troops from the Ukrainian border, and stop backing pro-Russian separatists. The G7 summit comes only 1 day ahead of the first meetings between President Putin and Western leaders since Crimea's integration into the Russian Federation back in March.
The G7 unanimously agrees with, which is for Mr. Putin to seize this moment, recognize Poroshenko is the legitimate leader of Ukraine, cease the support of separatists and the flow of arms, work with Ukraine to engage those in the East during this process of constitutional and economic reform.
First, the status quo is unacceptable. The continuing destabilization of eastern Ukraine must stop. Second, there are a set of things that need to happen. President Putin must recognize the legitimate election of President Poroshenko. He must stop arms crossing the border into Ukraine. He must cease Russian support for separatist groups. And third, if these things don't happen, then sectoral sanctions will follow. The next month will be vital in judging if President Putin has taken these steps. And that is what I will urge President Putin to do when I meet him later today.
The fact that I read just now that Russia will send the ambassador to the inauguration ceremony of the new Ukrainian president already is a testimony to a certain form of recognition. And now let us wait for further talks.
Werden wir mal die weiteren Gespräche abwarten.
It is the first meeting to be held without Russia. Leaders from the 7 industrialized nations have gathered in Brussels to discuss issues such as economy and energy security. The 2-day talks, however, have been mostly devoted to discussing how and when additional sanctions should be imposed on the former member Russia. But decisive action could not be taken. Rather, threats of further sanctions were again the tone of discussions.
At the upcoming meetings in Normandy, we intend to send a signal to the Russian president concerning the necessity of de-escalation in Ukraine. If this does not take place, then in the future we intend to consider again the possibility of imposing the third set of sanctions.
C'est pourquoi le G7 a
The G7 has indicated that dialogue, de-escalation and the process born from the elections must be encouraged. At the same time, the G7 is ready to intensify and put in place targeted sanctions if necessary. The aim is to ensure avoiding another confrontation process.
The remarks were met by Russian insistence that Kiev's new authorities should engage in an all-embracing dialogue to end the crisis. Russian leader Vladimir Putin also reiterated that Moscow has and will always respect its neighbors' sovereignty.
The Ukrainian government must now sit down and talk with their own people instead of using weapons, tanks, planes and helicopters. They must start the negotiating process. Yes, we recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. Moreover, would like Ukraine to act as a sovereign state. Joining any military bloc or any other rigid integration alliance amounts to a partial loss of sovereignty.
The diplomatic developments come one day ahead of the 17th anniversary of D-Day, an occasion that international powers are due to commemorate in Paris. The Russian president is due to hold crunch talks with some G7 leaders to see whether an instant de-escalation in eastern Ukraine is still possible.
This was the first G7 meeting to be held without Russia. When asked by the reporter what his thoughts were over Moscow's exclusion from the G7 table, Russian President Vladimir Putin wished the leaders bon appétit.
Хочу пожелать им приятного аппетита.
Well, the G7 has issued a communique encouraging Kiev to pursue its military operations. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has slammed world leaders for their backing of the Ukrainian military. Medvedev said that the so-called G7 talks about the measured actions of the Ukrainian army against its own people. Cynicism knows no limit in this case. Robert Olds, a London-based political analyst, joins me now via Skype to elaborate on this G7 summit. Mr. Olds, how will the Kremlin respond if further sanctions are imposed?
If further sanctions are imposed upon Russia, it will ultimately be counterproductive on the West. Russia's looking at moving away from trading in oil and other international goods in dollars. That will damage the American economy, which has been built on the dollar being the global reserve currency. If Russia moves away from that, that will actually harm America's position in the world. Also, if there's serious sanctions placed on Russia, then Russia will be entitled, it will be within its rights to reciprocate those sanctions. That will close off Russian markets to Western exports. It's a growing car market. That will damage car makers in Germany, for instance. Also, they may well restrict their gas imports to the European Union. That will harm the EU's economy because there'll be a shortage of supply, and even if supply can be met elsewhere, prices will go up. If they impose sanctions on Russia, Russia could restrict the gas, and that will mean higher gas prices in the EU, which will mean a major economic shock. It could plunge the European economy back into a very serious recession, when of course it's barely escaped from the last one. So if there's serious sanctions upon Russia, well, they can probably deal with it, they can handle it. Russia's looking at increasing its trade with China, but of course it's the European Union that will ultimately suffer if of course sanctions are placed upon Russia.
So can any talks between Russian and European leaders be constructive with such widespread polarization?
Well, whilst the Ukrainian government is actually killing civilians in the east of the country, and America and NATO and the European Union are supporting the actions of the government using fighter jets and all its military, including extremists targeting civilians, then of course there can be no constructive dialogue. It really is down to the Ukrainian government to cease its military actions against the east of the country, and it's for the West to stop supporting the Ukrainian government in what are illegal actions. It should not be using the army to kill its own civilians.
So how much power does Russia actually have to control the activists in the east of Ukraine?
The activists in the east of Ukraine, of course, some of them will, of course, have close links with Russia because, of course, the east of Ukraine is very, in a sense, Russian. The people there speak Russian predominantly. The Moscow Patriarch is their religious head. They look towards Russia. Most of their economy is tied in with Russia. 75% of Ukraine's industrial exports go to Russia. Most of its heavy industry is in the east. So there's very close links between Russia and the east of Ukraine. And of course, need to remember that the people in the east of the country are acting on their own will. They do not recognise the illegal regime change that took place in February of this year in Kiev, where the democratically elected Ukrainian president was ousted by a Western-backed coup. The people in the east of Ukraine did not recognise that, the new government which illegally took power, and of course then revolted against that new government, which of course in a sense they're entitled to do so because the new government did not have legitimacy. It took power illegally after a violent putsch, a violent coup effectively. So they have the right to stand up to the Kiev government. They've already had a referendum saying that they do not want to be part of this Kiev government. They want to have their own self-determination, which historically makes sense because large parts of eastern Ukraine were once independent of Kiev and of course were self-governing states for a brief period of time in the early 1920s. So it really is a very separate
Well, hasn't Russian President Putin already recognized Ukrainian President-elect Petro Poroshenko? I mean, why is that still a topic of discussion?
Well, the issue is that, of course, as soon as President Poroshenko won the election, he then stepped up the military campaign against the people of the east of Ukraine. President Putin has put out an olive branch to the West. He did this during the Olympics, showing that he wants to have cooperation with the West. But, of course, what's happened is that the West has imposed its own government on Kiev. And it is very ironic that America used to be attacking Poroshenko, now the current president of Ukraine, because he is an oligarch and he was seen as somewhat of a figure that was very controversial. Now, of course, the West is endorsing him because he's following on through with what they want, which is to take Ukraine into the Western orbit, make sure it's integrated, although perhaps not a full member of NATO, but integrated with NATO and the EU's common foreign policy as well, and integrated into the Western orbit and closely allied with the EU and the United States of America. But of course it should not be. Ukraine should be independent, it should be fully sovereign, and it should be neutral. It's very important to have a buffer between the European Union and Russia. Russia is concerned about the growing military build-up on its border. President Obama is very hawkish. He's putting more troops and more resources into the east of Europe. There's military patrols flying along Russia's borders. It is very worrying, and they're being threatening towards Russia. And of course, in those circumstances, it is natural that Russia will be very concerned and will perhaps even take action themselves to defend their own security, which does really rest upon Ukraine being independent of the Western orbit and being neutral, not being part of the European Union's common foreign policy, nor part of the NATO defence alliance.
All right, Mr. Robert Olds, a political analyst, thank you very much for that. Meanwhile, the fight for Ukraine's east has killed hundreds while forcing thousands to flee their homes. As government forces have announced measures to send more troops to fight pro-Russian activists, many residents are now dealing with a food and water shortage.
The sound of gunshots pierced through the once silent nights of Ukraine's eastern city of Donetsk, as fighting raged on between pro-Russian activists and government forces. Despite Kiev's fierce military operations in the east, which has left at least 40 dead, self-defense forces remain largely in control of the area. This has prompted Ukraine's government to beef up its security presence there, vowing to destroy what they call criminals.
Unfortunately, massive criminal groups have already been created in conflict zones, namely Luhansk and Donetsk regions. They are headed by people who have blood up to their elbows, and we clearly realize there is no possibility to reach an agreement with them. We can only destroy them.
The bulk of the fighting has been centered on Slavyansk, 100 kilometers north of the city of Donetsk. But reports of atrocities are widespread. Ukrainian armed forces have allegedly killed more than 25 injured people after they shelled a local hospital. Meanwhile, fighting has also damaged the water supply to 5 cities in the combat zone, including Slavyansk. Although many families have fled the bloodshed in the city, others have sought refuge in makeshift underground shelters, with many facing a shortage of food and medicine. And while the government is saying it plans to send a 3rd battalion to the east, it looks like it will be innocent civilians who will bear the brunt of the ongoing bloodshed.
The Israeli regime has reportedly invited bids for 1,500 new illegal settler units in retaliation for a new Palestinian government backed by Hamas. The Palestinian government has denounced this move and called on Washington to take serious steps against this latest Israeli violation.
The Zionist regime has announced the approval of another 1,500 illegal settler units in the east of Al-Quds and the West Bank. Israeli Settlement Minister Uri Ariel made the announcement for new tenders for settler units in a number of Zionist settlements on Palestinian lands. Of the new homes, 400 will be in the Israeli-annexed East Jerusalem, with the rest elsewhere in the occupied West Bank. I congratulate the decision to give a proper Zionist response to the establishment of the Palestinian Terror Cabinet. Meanwhile, the Palestinian government said the illegal Israeli settlement policy was unacceptable and warned of an unprecedented response from the new government. Furthermore, the Palestinian government said it would appeal to the UN Security Council over the aggressive Israeli move. This latest decision by the Israelis to build more illegal settlements comes amid Zionist anger at its US allies' decision to work with the newly merged administration for the West Bank and Gaza, formed by Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas on Monday with the support of the Palestinian resistance group Hamas. However, Dan Shapiro, the US ambassador to the Israeli entity, also condemned the latest announcement concerning settlement expansion. We oppose settlement construction in the West Bank as well as the announcements regarding such construction. We would do so with or without this disputed case of a new Palestinian transitional government. The row of the new Palestinian government is further testing the once sacrosanct relationship between the Israeli entity and the United States, already stained by the collapse of US-brokered peace talks that failed due to Israeli persistence in continuing illegal settlement construction.
Well, the European Union has also condemned the Israelis for their plans to build more Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian land. European diplomats said that the construction of the settlements would cause international isolation and damage the Israeli entity. In addition, the EU has called on the Israeli authorities to reverse this decision and to direct all their efforts towards an early resumption of the peace talks. Meanwhile, Israeli occupation forces clashed with Palestinian protesters marking Nakba Day, which commemorates the six-day war that resulted in the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Al-Quds. The demonstrators also demanded an end to Israeli destruction of World Heritage sites and breaches of international law in Al-Quds.
The deafening sound of stun grenades rang across a busy street of the occupied West Bank city of Ramallah. As is typically the case, this is how Israeli occupation forces responded to a peaceful march marking the annual Nakba Day, or the Day of Setback. With our souls and our blood, we sacrifice for you, Palestine. These are the words Palestinians were chanting as they marched to mourn the day the Israelis launched a surprise attack, resulting in the occupation of the West Bank and Al-Quds and the displacing of hundreds of thousands of people.
We're protesting on the 47th anniversary of the Israeli illegal occupation of the West Bank, Gaza and Jerusalem, to protest against this illegal occupation which has become the longest in modern history and which has transformed into a system of apartheid and racial discrimination.
Israeli troops fired stun grenades at Palestinian protesters and activists during clashes near the Qalandia checkpoint, the main roadblock separating occupied Ramallah from Al-Quds. The protesters also said that they have not forgotten the hundreds of Palestinian detainees on hunger strike for their confinement without trial in Israeli prisons.
We're also demonstrating in solidarity with our prisoners who are on hunger strike. 1,500 prisoners are striking to demand the end of administrative detention, which is unacceptable and is a violation of every law in the world.
The Nakba continues to be a deep wound for the Palestinians as the Israelis fortify their illegal occupation, detain people without charge, and continue to step up their theft of Palestinians' water, resources and land.
Scenes of joy and jubilation have gripped the streets of Syria after President Bashar al-Assad secured a landslide win in Tuesday's presidential polls. Assad, who will serve another 7-year term in office, said that the high voter turnout in those elections has sent a strong message to the West and all those countries involved in the war against Syria. Over 11 million Syrians, or 74% of the country's eligible voters, participated in Tuesday's polls.
Thousands of Syrians took to the streets to celebrate the re-election of Bashar al-Assad as the country's president. Syria's parliamentary speaker announced late Wednesday that President Bashar al-Assad had won the elections with a sweeping 88.7% of the vote.
I declare the victory of Dr. Bashar Hafiz al-Assad as president of the Syrian Arab Republic, with an absolute majority of the votes cast in the election.
International observers stressed that the elections were fair and transparent, dismissing Western allegations that the polls were a charade.
I spoke to many of them. I said, who are you voting for? They told me, for President Assad. Why is that? They are voting for peace. They are voting for Syria. They are voting for a future. They are voting for a civilization.
Fireworks were set off for the first time in Damascus since the crisis began in the country over 3 years ago, with servicemen firing shots into the air. Syrians filled the streets and waved the national flag with pride. Downtown Square, where Assad supporters were watching the results being announced live, transformed into a celebration.
Everybody is congratulating Bashar al-Assad. We all support him. He is the state gentleman.
Came here to congratulate Bashar. May Allah bless Bashar al-Assad.
Presidential candidate Hassan al-Nouri conceded defeat and called on Assad to continue with his efforts to bring the country out of the more than 3-year-old crisis.
I also want to congratulate Bashar. Congratulations, Dr. Bashar.
Despite widespread Western criticism, Syrians appear undeterred and satisfied with the fact that Bashar al-Assad has returned to power and believe he is the one man who can steer their beloved country back to its glory days.
Well, the Iranian military's top brass has announced that the resounding victory of Bashar al-Assad in Syria's presidential election has disgraced the United States and militant groups operating in the Arab state. The chief of staff of Iran's armed forces said that the victory of Bashar al-Assad in Syria's presidential election, with more than 10 million votes, has humiliated the United States and opponents of the Syrian people. Today, Bashar al-Assad has in fact been reaffirmed by the majority of the Syrian people. Also praising the results of Syria's presidential elections, Moscow announced that the vote which President Bashar al-Assad won was fair, free, and transparent.
Russian observers have made a definite conclusion that the poll was carried out in a transparent way, despite the difficult security situation in the country, and they noted a very high voter turnout.
Meanwhile, the Syrian army has made further gains across the country, namely in the northern province of Aleppo. Aleppo has been the scene of deadly clashes between government troops and foreign-backed militants during the past week. The Syrian army targeted insurgents in several districts, including Salahuddin and Al-Ansari, killing and injuring a number of gunmen and destroying their weapons caches. Stay with us here at Al World News, coming up after the break. Libya's Supreme Court declares the election of the country's new premier as illegal. Welcome back. Here are the top stories we're following this hour. The Iraqi army foils an attack by ISIL militants on the holy shrine of Imam al-Hassan al-Askari in the northern city of Samarra. Obama gives Putin 1 month to change course over the Ukraine crisis before ratcheting up sanctions. The U.S. and the EU condemn Israeli plans to construct over 1,000 additional settler units on occupied Palestinian land. And Bashar al-Assad says that the high voter turnout in Syria's presidential elections sends a strong message to the country's enemies. Libya's Supreme Court has ruled that the election of the new Prime Minister Ahmed Maitik was illegal. This as disarray continues to grip the country's major cities.
The election of Ahmed Maitik as Libya's new prime minister has now been ruled illegal by the country's Supreme Court. Although an appeal was filed by Maitik's lawyers against the verdict, the court ruled that the vote was conducted in violation of the country's temporary constitution. Maitik's swearing in last month was immediately challenged by his predecessor and outgoing premier Abdullah Thani. Thenni has until now refused to transfer power, although forces allegedly loyal to Maltik have occupied the government compound. Some judicial officials said the earlier parliamentary confidence vote, which confirmed Maltik as the new prime minister, was invalid because less than half of the lawmakers attended the session. The political paralysis mirrors a much bloodier crisis plaguing the North African state. Just yesterday, unidentified gunmen fired a rocket-propelled grenade at Maltik's office. However, the premier is said not to have been there at the time of the attack. On another front, former Libyan General Khalifa Haftar survived an assassination attempt outside Benghazi. Haftar has been battling Islamist militias, which have wreaked havoc across the country since the ouster of former leader Muammar Gaddafi. But as far as Tripoli is concerned, Haftar is trying to seize power through a coup. Outgoing Premier Thenni traveled to Benghazi, a move that his spokesman said was a result of the Prime Minister's wish to be closer to the situation on the ground. However, Thenni's presence is unlikely to change the course of events. While the bloody battles have been worsening, rival political factions have been asserting their authority through the use of force. And with all eyes set on the June 25th elections, few Libyans believe that the coming weeks will bring a solution to the ongoing crisis.
Political activist Kharsa Al-Mashai joins us now via Skype from London to discuss this further. Now, how significant is this ruling by the Supreme Court against Prime Minister Ahmed Maitik?
Oh, not yet. The final decision will be on the Monday, the 9th of July. So we should wait till the 9th of July, then we will see how is the decision, and then we have to obey the decision.
Well, how legitimate were those parliamentary elections in your view?
Yeah, of course, they should obey the decision, which is the 9th of July. So all of Libyan and Prime Minister Maitik and Etni, all of them, they will obey the decision.
And what about General Khalifa Haftar's operation in Benghazi? Has it changed anything on the ground?
You know, Khalifa Haftar was one of the Al-Gaddafi's groups, so, you know, many peoples will not be accepted. Well, he will not be accepted by many people, I think. And also now it's 3 weeks of his operation in Benghazi, and we haven't seen any result, any good result. We have only seen many blood, many people have been killed from Sharia, from Ansar Sharia, and from Khalifa Haftar's people. Also, many civilians has been killed. Ansar Sharia accused Khalifa Haftar of killing civilians, and Khalifa Haftar's armies accused Ansar Sharia of killing civilians. So the situation in Benghazi is very bloody at the moment. 3 weeks of blood, 3 weeks of conflict, and we haven't seen any good results till now.
Yes, well, the government in Tripoli certainly doesn't like Haftar, but he does seem to have garnered quite a bit of support among Libyans. How do you explain that?
Yeah, you know, yeah, it's the situation in Benghazi, and maybe people from Benghazi, they hate blood. Every day people killing, every day problems in Benghazi. So that's maybe some people will support him just to get rid of these problems in Benghazi. And some people, they say, no, he was one of Al-Gaddafi groups for many years. And he one of the leader in Chad war, which is between Libya and Chad in 80s. So it's the picture is not clear yet.
Well, let's just change course a little bit. What scenarios can we expect in the lead up to the June 25th legislative elections?
Sorry, can you repeat it again?
Yes, I asked what scenarios can we expect in the lead up to the June 25th legislative elections?
Yeah, 25th of July is...
All right, we seem to be having some technical difficulties. That is Ms. Kharsa Al-Mashai, a political activist. The international community has largely welcomed the election of former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as Egypt's next president. For its part, Iran has expressed hope that the election of the new leader can usher in a period of better relations between the two regional powers. Our Cairo correspondent Karim Ezzeddin has more.
Soon after Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was announced Egypt's president on Tuesday evening, the international community mostly reacted positively, with several heads of state congratulating him on winning the country's top post. The Iranian Foreign Ministry expressed its hope that the democratic process in Egypt will reflect the will of the people. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister further affirmed the importance of historic and cultural ties between the two countries.
As long as it's for the good of our nation and army, we support our administration. We don't need enemies, and we welcome any new allies. Restoring our relations with Iran assures that Egypt is a major country.
We appreciate whoever supports our country and our vision and consider them an ally. Iran is a major country and it's good to have Iran as an ally.
Meanwhile, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani received an invitation late on Monday from Egypt's interim leader Adli Mansour to attend Sisi's inauguration.
I think
that Egyptian-Iranian relations will see great progress based on that common respect of the will of the people, as the Iranian response to the invitation was positive.
When Egypt's 2011 revolution succeeded in toppling then-President Hosni Mubarak, Iran began engaging in more cordial relations with Egypt. Islamist President Mohammad Morsi invited Ahmadinejad to the capital Cairo, making him the first Iranian president to visit Egypt since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The cultural and the historical ties between Egypt and Iran have always been strong and positive, and with the two major countries taking actions to reinforce these positive ties, the general mood in Egypt seems optimistic over the future relations with Iran. Reporting for Latiga TV from Cairo, Karim Ezzeddin.
At least 14 Yemeni soldiers and a civilian were killed on Thursday by suspected al-Qaeda gunmen in a southern province, where the army has been battling the extremist group since late April. The militants attacked a checkpoint near the Shabwa province village of Bayhan with automatic rifles, also wounding a number of soldiers. The assault came just hours after a drone strike killed 3 al-Qaeda suspects late on Wednesday as they were traveling in a vehicle in the east of Sana'a. Hundreds of people are feared dead in a suspected Boko Haram attack on 4 villages in northeast Nigeria. Some community leaders put the death toll as high as 400 to 500, although there was no independent verification of the claim due to poor communication and difficulties by the emergency services in accessing the area. The Canadian police have been scouring a city in the eastern province of New Brunswick, hunting for a man believed to have been shot dead 3 officers and wounded 2 others in a brazen attack. Residents were told to remain in their homes as police searched for the alleged shooter, who was identified as 24-year-old Justin Bork.
Around 7:30 on June 4th, while responding to a call of an armed man in the north end of the city of Moncton, 3 of Kodiak RCMP's officers were shot and killed. 2 other officers were also injured, but their life is not threatened at this time.
Indian police announced that a woman was shot dead in the northeast of the country by militants of the outlawed Garo National Liberation Army after she resisted their attempt to gang rape her. The incident, which is the latest in a string of violent sex attacks to shock the country, comes as a lawmaker from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's ruling party stated that rape is not always wrong.
Rape is a social crime. It is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. It is difficult to stop rapes completely, as a rapist does not reveal his intentions before committing the crime. We take action only when it is reported.
With just days left before the World Cup kicks off in Brazil, 12,000 demonstrators from the country's homeless workers movement marched on Sao Paulo World Cup Stadium in protest against the government's housing policies and threatened to hold further rallies during the international football tournament.
In a city more famous for its carnivals, a different rhythm ruled the streets of Brazil's São Paulo. 12,000 members of the country's homeless workers movement marched on São Paulo's World Cup stadium, calling on the government to heed to their demands. Many Brazilians are angry about the staggering amount of money spent on the upcoming World Cup at the expense of public services.
Today, we want to get the attention of public power, marching to Itaquereo, saying that we want to negotiate and open a channel of dialogue with public power to negotiate our demands. If they do not attend to our needs, we already know the way to the stadium, and on the 12th, we will be there again.
Around 170,000 families have been removed from their homes across Brazil, while thousands have been forced to live in makeshift tents.
We need housing urgently because we cannot handle living in the mud under canvas.
Manuel Rodriguez said that the protests are out in force to show the world what is really happening in Brazil.
So you can see how Brazil really is. The government spends billions on games and the stadiums, and we're all left out in the cold without a house.
Further protests and strikes are expected during the World Cup, as people here warn that if the government does not improve its housing policy, they will step up their rallies during the international tournament.
Well, Argentina is heading to the World Cup in Brazil with a strong squad built around four-time World Player of the Year Lionel Messi. The team is hoping to lift the trophy for a third time after a 28-year-long wait.
Argentina romped through South America's World Cup qualifying competition, finishing top of the standings with 35 goals in 16 games. With a side built around four-time World Player of the Year, Lionel Messi, the team has a great chance of ending their long wait for a third World Cup crown. It's 28 long years since Diego Maradona inspired Argentina to last lift the trophy.
It's been a long time since Argentina was among the four finalists of the World Cup, and for a country as football crazy as ours, it's too long.
Argentina's world-class attack features talents such as Sergio Aguero, Gonzalo Higuain and Ángel Di María. The key, though, will still be whether Barcelona's Messi can bring his best form to the biggest stage and dispel any doubts that he's one of the greatest players of all time. The 26-year-old has won everything going at club level, but there's one thing missing from his trophy cabinet: a World Cup winner's medal.
Not all the responsibility has to fall on Leo Messi. We all have to contribute with what we know to try to reach our objective. We must remain calm. We must work hard this week, so when the ball touches the ground and we play our first game, we don't make mistakes.
Coach Alejandro Sabella has transformed the side's fortunes since taking over after a poor campaign in the Copa America in 2011.
Spain and Germany are a little bit on top of everyone else. Brazil, as the host, is also up there. But then there's us, and we have great potential.
The omens look good. Argentina are in a relatively easy group with African Cup of Nations champions Nigeria, Iran and debutants Bosnia. And the last two times the tournament has been held in Latin America, in 1978 and 1986, they have reached the final and won.
I'm Khaddad with you this hour. Let's take a last look at our headlines. The Iraqi army foils an attack by ISIL militants on the holy shrine of Imam al-Hassan al-Askari in the northern city of Samarra. Obama gives Putin 1 month to change course over the Ukraine crisis before ratcheting up sanctions. The US and the EU condemn Israeli plans to construct over 1,000 additional settler units on occupied Palestinian land. And Bashar al-Assad says that the high voter turnout in Syria's presidential elections sends a strong message to the country's enemies. That's it for this bulletin of Al World News. Have a good night.